Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here tonight at the Vilna Shul. My name is Gio Poor. I'm the Director of Operations and Finance here, and it's my great joy to welcome you all here to this event. The Vilna was built in 1919 and was an operational synagogue until around 1985. It sat empty until some people wanted to turn it into a parking lot, and then thankfully some people moved against that and saved this building, got it declared a historical site, and created the nonprofit that now runs in this building. We are a center for Jewish arts and culture. We here at the Vilna are always looking for people who are doing interesting things that are both rooted in Jewish tradition and working to creatively evolve the never-ending story which is Jewish culture. We're helping people to understand their Judaism and helping them to understand themselves and the world that we find ourselves in. And it's hard to think of two individuals that exemplify this more than the two that are going to be speaking here for us tonight. J. Michaelson is the author of 10 books. His most recent one, The Secret That Is Not a Secret, is, as you heard, his first work of fiction. It is a collection of 10 short stories. His previous book, The Heresy of Jacob Frank, won the 2022 National Jewish Book Award for Scholarship. He is also a journalist, appearing regularly on CNN, in Rolling Stone, The Daily Beast, The Forward, and other publications, and a fellow at the AJU. Noah Feldman is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, the chairman of the Society of Fellows, and founding director of the Julis Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law. He is also a columnist, for which he has great renown. Also the author of 10 books, including his latest forthcoming title, To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the stage to Jay and Noah. Please welcome them.
Thank you everybody for being here. It's a huge privilege to have the opportunity among familiar faces, some less familiar faces, in this extraordinary place that, if you're a Boston Jew like I am, is kind of ground zero of your identity, especially if you're a Litvak-identified Boston Jew. The occasion couldn't be more auspicious. As you just heard, there's almost no domain in which Jay is not an extraordinarily accomplished thinker, writer, and activist. We've known each other since law school, so I don't want to say how long that is, but we started law school 30 years ago this fall.
Oh my God.
What I want to do is begin just by asking Jay a few questions to get us going. And so let me start with the first one. So as Mark described, Jay, when you do scholarship, you do that at the highest possible level. Your Jacob Frank book is an incredible book. And also, if you read that after Olga Tokarczuk's Nobel Prize winning Books of Jacob, as I happen to do, you realize that she took a lot of the book from your book, which is cool. Or not.
Still waiting for those Nobel Prize residuals,
exactly,
but otherwise.
Exactly, the residuals haven't yet come through. And when you do theology spectacularly. Among Jay's books is a book that I deeply, deeply love, called Everything is God, that I would urge everybody to read, a sort of account of non-dual Judaism. When you do activism, and now on top of it all, this spectacular book of loosely linked fictional stories. But these are stories that engage mysticism, Jewish mysticism, in a serious and profound way. The cover shows that. You can see it's some combination of Miro and the Sfirot, which maybe is not a coincidence. So I want to start by asking you a question, the way they would ask it in Congress. Jay, are you now, or have you ever been, a cabalist?
Guilty. First, as somebody who's testified before Congress, I feel like you're particularly, well placed to ask that question. Thank you for those really generous words. Noah's kind of one of my heroes, so it's really kind of a treat.
One of his fanboys, so it's a good combo.
It's really a treat. And I think for me, so I have a PhD in Jewish thought and worked in Kabbalah, and for a while it was central to my teaching and to my consciousness. Gradually that stopped being the case. but it's still, for me, it never lost its appeal as a kind of literary or artistic matrix. The symbolism of the Kabbalah, the interplay between sexuality and spirituality, the complexity, the Baroque nature of this beyond theology, this kind of recapturing of Jewish myth was, for me, irresistible. And I love it. Even though I don't find it part of my kind of personal spiritual practice anymore. So I don't know, I used to call myself like a neo-cabalist back in the day, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I think, like the neo-Hasidim call themselves, like we're just aware no Kabbalist would tolerate me as a member of, one of their own. And yet, there's just because Hamlet maybe didn't happen historically, or maybe it did, doesn't, affect the power of that literary work. But that's a good question. Yeah, I don't have enough magical thinking left in me in that way. And actually, it's interesting with this.
And it's interesting to hear you say that, because this book is pervaded by characters who either think magically or think they don't think magically until they do.
And that's what I was so fascinated by. I was asked a few times around the book, like, well, why are so many characters Orthodox? And it's because I'm interested in the depth of that belief. It's not like Orthodoxy in particular, but just to really inhabit that mythic world. And, I've met some hardcore real Kabbalists, and, they're half on this plane and half somewhere else. And you really do, when you study Zohar, for example, and you really get into it in a profound way, it pervades your consciousness, and the symbols become more real than reality, which I think a lot of the characters in the book are struggling with. It's not necessarily the world I want to live in, where ideas are more real than reality, but I am fascinated by that. I know and have learned from a lot of people from that's really true.
That's a very rich and I think a profound answer. Let me ask you about an aspect of this book that I want to ask about because of a comment you made when we were coming in. Jay said to me, well, if you think back to where we were 30 years ago, it's not entirely shocking that we would be like right here, right now, having some version of this conversation. And I think that's actually true, which I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing about us, but I think it's plausible. There is one element that at least I wouldn't have seen coming, as it were, which is that one of the central, very beautifully handled themes of this work is sex, and sex in its relationship to revelation and concealment, and especially in relation to mysticism. And you have a fascinating view about that, which I want to get to. When you think about the relationship between mystical experience and sexual experience, which, as I say, is at the center of a bunch of these stories, can you say a few words that would get people, that would draw people in? I mean, I thought of doing this by just reading your quotes and asking you to explicate them, which would be very, yeshivish.
Yeah.
And maybe we should
do that.
All right, I'll just read
learning.
one. And this is from, so there are 10 stories in this collection, and everyone who's interested in esotericism knows that the middle chapter is where you expect to find the deepest secrets.
It's not a secret, though.
Well, it's a secret that is not a secret, right? So isn't it both a secret and not a secret?
That's the concept.
Okay, good. So in this story, The Secrets of Nakedness, you've got two lines that really capture this. One is a character says, maybe the sexual is a metaphor for the spiritual. And then there's another sentence that says something very similar. Religion isn't sublimated sex. Sex is sublimated religion. Explicate for us.
Well, I love that. That line is the fulcrum of the book. So this is my first conversation about the book, and this is the first time I've been called out so effectively. Yeah, I'm just I'm fascinated by weird religion, which for me is not a negative term, but any kind of, so whether it's new religious movements or whether it's mystical Judaism, or whether it's the most important form of religiosity in America today, which is charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity, right? The kind of religion that's determining our politics is not the kind of rationalistic, mainline Protestantism that may have sort of set the tone for America, a century ago, right? It is a profoundly mystical and I would say sublimated, eroticized form of devotional practice where people are speaking in tongues and they're having a direct relationship with the divine and they're experiencing a constant war between Satan and between whether it's Christ or God in their lives. And that's determining, I mean, just today, this is like an appropriate J/Noah thing, right? We just wrote an article about the Alabama Supreme Court decision on embryos counting as people. And that flows directly from this kind of intense, I would say, mystical theology. And it's not a marginal phenomenon in our public lives, although I don't think it quite gets the attention that it could get from those who look at politics. So for me, that's a dark, maybe for most of us in our sort of liberal bubble, like that might be a sort of dark example or a difficult one. But for me, it's the mirror image of this radiant, ecstatic experience that I've had over the years in Jewish and not Jewish contexts, and certainly that people who are far more advanced practitioners than I have report. And there is this tension, I think, that is irresolvable. The kind of ecstasy of the flesh and the ecstasy of the spirit, and whether those are different or the same, or mirror images of each other, or reflections of each other, or levels of each other. One is in one world, one is another. I mean, maybe the profound secret that isn't a secret is that there's no secret. And that, for me, I don't have an answer. This isn't a nonfiction book. Like that is the tension that I find so animating. And I have some friends here from like the queer spiritual world and fellow travelers from that world, and where you see what happens when we're blocked spiritually or blocked sexually, or we're compartmentalized or we're controlled, and how that. And some of it's probably from my own life. I mean, it's true. I guess that is true. When we were in law school, I was still mostly in the closet and still struggling with that in a way that some of the characters in the book are struggling with their own sexual being. And there are a lot of renderings of that, but not this rendering of that struggle. That felt like this feels like the book that I could write, and that was what was so exciting about it.
And it is very exciting to read, for sure. I want to ask you about weird religion and delve into that, because I love that phrase, and I even have a pet theory about it. But before I do, I just wanted to offer some context to people about the Alabama Supreme Court decision, which is only a day and a half old, that Jay alluded to. It's interesting because the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, he didn't write the majority opinion, but he wrote a concurrence. And in it, he said explicitly that since the state of Alabama enacted a constitutional amendment in 2022 that insists on the, quote, sanctity of human life, he looked in the dictionary, he said that the word sanctity means holiness, and then he said to make sense of the original public meaning of this constitutional amendment, we need religion, specifically Christianity. And then he gave us a little-known Dutch theologian called Petrus of Maastricht, and then he gave
little known to you? What do you mean, Petrus of Maastricht?
Sorry, little known to me. Sorry, I'm in the company of a much greater scholar. Then John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism, he threw in a little bit of Aquinas, which he didn't want to say too much about, maybe because Aquinas is Catholic. And then he concluded he summed up the view that the reason that life is sanctified in Alabama is entirely based on a purely theological account. And he openly said, and I actually don't know of another opinion anywhere in the U.S. state or federal reports that says this, the way to interpret the state constitution is through theology. Boom, full stop. Now, is that a manifestation of weird religion in your view? Because if so, I have to like it a lot better than I did like it in the column that I wrote about it yesterday. I didn't come forward very positive about it.
No, I mean, well, I like that. It's funny. It's a good thing I didn't read your column because I just posted mine today. The opinion's very honest in a way.
That's true.
That most are not. There's always this kind of claim of like, well, we have these fundamental values and respect for life. And he's like, no, human life is sacred from the moment of conception because it's the image of God. And this is from the Chief Justice. And it's not just Alabama. And I'm sure you noted this too. This is a direct lineage of Dobbs. And it's the same sort of valuing of life in this way. I think it is weird religion in several ways. First, Protestants never used to care about abortion until the 1970s. In fact, there were plenty of good conservative Protestant evangelical writings from the 60s mocking Catholics for caring about this and saying how ridiculous Catholics think that life begins at conception, life begins at birth. So the reason I'm fascinated by this as an example of weird religion is how recent it is. Right? I mean, this is like a 50-year-old doctrine at most that conservative evangelicals and conservative Protestants would care about. And second, the fact that it is this kind of, I don't know if I would call it a mystical theology, but it's a sort of magical theology, that there's something magic, that this embryo that is 1/100th of an inch has this capacity of this divinity to it. That's pretty weird religion, right? And I'm also interested, I think in the sort of liberal spiritual world that I live in, there's a misconception that it's only liberals and progressives who do weird religion. So we do meditation, or we do ecstatic prayer and things like that, and we do yoga or whatever. And no, I mean, I just remember when I was living in Israel, is an example of where some of that conservative weird religion is.
Yeah.
And at first I was really thrown by this, because I was a guy who was a nice liberal, meditating Jewish renewal dude. And here were these people who were like smoking a lot of weed and singing Karl Bach songs and chanting, and were the settler hilltop youth. And, not just the right wing, but like, the way right wing, if we can even use that right and left language. And I could not understand. It's like, well, wait, you're having profound spiritual experiences and then having this like intense ethnocentric view about the world. And I think it was something I had to get past, that this notion that like spirituality, I definitely thought for a while as a meditation teacher that meditation was going to save the world. That if we could just open to the truth of our experience and be more present with our difficult emotions, things like that, maybe we could be a little less violent or a little less consumed by those emotions. And I don't know, I think the jury is definitely out on that. So yeah, weird religion is everywhere. And one of the great Kabbalists of our age, Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, again, on the extreme political right, not like security right, I mean like very, very far right in the Israeli scene. And that was part of my alienation from Kabbalah. But I never got alienated from its beauty and its complexity, and no amount of reactionary religion can take that. But I do want to make that, so like, that's the perfect segue, I feel like, because Noah also has this big book that's coming out. And so far, The Secret That's Not a Secret hasn't been featured in a New Yorker piece, but To Be a Tree Today has. And I'm just curious, like, what I'm interested in. So for folks, I assume you haven't read all 600 pages of the book yet. So
Only 400 pages.
You cut the footnotes. A lot of the book is I think the most useful map or schematic of here's different Judaisms and how did we get to this place. And a whole third of the book is about Israel. Good timing as a writer. And then there's also, I guess, I know you didn't want to pick teams in the book a little bit, but I'm curious as to where you relate to the weird religion part or the mystical religion part in the sort of panorama of Judaisms that are offered in your work.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Jay, and it actually fits into what I wanted to say about weird religion. So I was raised I went to the Maimonides school in Brookline. I grew up in Cambridge, and so I was raised in a form of modern orthodoxy that was hyper-rationalist. And I would say that we collectively in that community were deeply, at the time, embarrassed by, ashamed by, and in flight from what we thought of as weird religion. And in that we thought somewhat plausibly we had something in common with Moses Maimonides himself, because Moses Maimonides tried to cleanse the content of Judaism of anything that seemed to him weird, so that everything would correspond to reason. He really advocated for a religion of reason. Even if there was some practice that seemed weird on the surface, Maimonides was devoted to coming up with a creative explanation for why it actually wasn't that weird, if only you saw it, for example, in the context of the ancient Near East. He thought that sacrifices to the gods were weird, which in the Middle Ages they were. And he said, well, God doesn't actually want the sacrifices, but in the ancient Near East, the only way you could communicate with the gods was through sacrifice, so if God hadn't instituted sacrifices, the Israelites wouldn't have been able to communicate, so we needed them. And now we don't need them anymore in the same way. Perfect example of explaining away the weird. And it took me a long time to shift my views on this. Even when I moved away from the formal Orthodox religious practice that I was raised in, I was so far from embracing weird, I guess I thought I was getting even further away from weird. I now think that all religion is weird religion. I think it's all weird religion. I think to devote your whole life to observing 613 commandments plus all of the rabbinic lines around those, many of which are weird, while devoting your whole life to the idea that they aren't weird, is an extremely weird way to live your life. It's like really, really, really weird. And in fact, it's hard to explain why you do all these things if you actually think God is this pure reason or rationality. And in the side, you're like, and actually, he doesn't really care about this. And in fact, he's not a he, and there isn't really a caring there. It's a different situation. That's also weird. So I now have the view that all religion is weird. And I think it has brought me much closer to all different kinds of religion, especially the mystical kinds, because I now think all religion is weird and a good thing too. Because I think that religion enables you to embrace those parts of human existence that are in fact weird. And I think there are many parts of human existence that are extremely weird. I mean, sex is a really, really good example of something that in every respect you can allegorize it, you can poeticize it, but there's something ineluctably weird about it. So I think, to me, in the not taking sides in my own book, I think it's an impulse maybe not dissimilar from your ability to enter in your fiction into the thought worlds of people who have very different practices than you do, different beliefs than you do. It helps to have occasionally had those beliefs and practices. It helped me in my book to know that I had held the views of many people across the spectrum at different times in my life. But once you're in it, I think there's something really liberating about realizing its weirdness. And last but not least, you mentioned sort of broadly New Age forms of religion. And in the last chapter of Jay's book about Jacob Frank, the last chapter, which is a very bold, creative, and present-oriented chapter, Jay argues that contemporary New Age religion is in some important ways anticipated by the particular forms of ideas and belief in the middle and late 18th century that Jacob Frank embodied. Those forms of religion, I was also brought up to have complete contempt for, total contempt. Because not only were they not rational, but the weird parts were not old. Right? This is like, it's like the very unjust bias against Mormonism, which holds that, it's perfectly implausible to believe that God gave the Torah to Moses or that he split the Red Sea, but that's fine, because we still have the Passover Seder, because that was a long time ago. But if someone believes that Joseph Smith was a prophet, that's preposterous. I mean, that's a really dumb view. Like if one is ridiculous, the other is ridiculous. But again, I was brought up to believe that the newness was itself a source of embarrassment. And now I just think people are reinventing their weird all the time. I mean, you also showed maybe it's not that new, but that's a separate point.
Yeah, I mean, I love where you just ended there. I feel like I am interested in the book in exploring some of the parts that aren't so liberating, right? So where that religious impulse to flee the body, for example. In the very first story, the sort of setup is a Chabad Hasidic woman can't stand her husband's big bushy beard. And if you know Chabad men, they tend to have big bushy beards. And she can't get away from it. She tries and tries to allegorize it, to get away from it. It's a symbol, it's a cosmic something. And she goes and learns a bunch of Kabbalah about it, which was fun for me to go then research all of the Kabbalah of beards and learning about that. But in the end, there's like the ineluctable physicality, like you just can't get away. And for her, that's a trap, right? And I've seen that in my own life in a way where there's this perceived tension between the thing that there's not actually a tension between. And some of the characters in the book break free from that and some don't. And I'm still, as we're both parents of kids and deciding how Jewy or not to raise them, and it's a very live conundrum for me. I don't think it's a simple cost-benefit analysis, and I think it's very personal and it depends. But which are the parts? My central religious text of my life is a poem by Adrian Rich called "Diving into the Wreck," which is kind of this queer Jewish feminist allegory about engaging with the patriarchy, with tradition, with whatever the shipwreck of our civilization is. And she writes, as the scuba diver exploring the wreck, that it's finding that she wants to know the whole story of the wreck and then see if there's something that can be salvaged, even though what's there, is a book in which her name does not appear. And I'm still involved in the project of what's the shipwreck and what's the treasure, or what's to be salvaged and what's to be set aside. And I don't think that's what's so liberating after writing a bunch of nonfiction books, to not have any answer. And the question and the tension is so much more interesting and kind of generative for me than, here's the 5 things that you can, here's your...
But can I push back? Because you say that you don't have an answer, and that's fair, it's fiction. But in this book, Sabbatinism, the set of ideas associated with the 17th century self-presenting Messiah, one would say today false Messiah, but that already takes an ideological position, Shabtai Tzvi.
I like the use of the word presenting,
exactly,
I present as male, I present as a Messiah, I present as...
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, I think you talk a lot about Frank's gender presentation, and it's true. He is also presenting arguably as a Messiah. But for you in this book, I think it's objectively true that you are salvaging aspects of these movements that are presented in mainstream Jewish thought today as though they were kind of roads not taken. And I think fiction can be said to have an argument, and there's an argument that those roads are taken, that there is salvage. And in some of the most powerful stories here, I'm thinking of the story that's set in Central Park, the Sabbatian of Central Park, which I won't give it away because
I was going to read the end of it, actually. I was literally thinking, I'm going to do the end of the Sabbatian to illustrate what you're just saying.
All right, good. Well, all right, I'll hand you the book so you can find it. The setup is that in this story, a young, I think he's a Chabad Chassid from Context, at some point we'll talk about Chabad and its relationship to these things, is giving an account to his rabbi of an encounter that he had in Central Park, and to give you a hint of it, I'll tell you that it takes place in the Ramble. So for those of you with a historical consciousness of Central Park, that's an important aspect of it.
So I'm going to read 2 of the last 3 paragraphs of this story, and I'll pre-apologize by saying that there's a lot of Hebrew and Yiddish in here, and even a little bit of Aramaic. But the consolation is that I don't think anyone will know all of the specific Chabad, Hasidic, Kabbalistic words, so it's not just you, it's me. So I'll do the third to last and then the last paragraph. So this is at the kind of right after the climax, or actually, this is the climax of that sexual encounter in the Ramble in Central Park. And I had in my head an image when he said that, of Chava with the snake, of woman being the source of temptation, which we learned about in yeshiva, that Lilith and Chava and all women were of the Sitra Achra. But as he said it, I felt him so deep inside of me, and I realized it was true, that I was that. I was a woman, and I believed him, or my body believed him. And the words of the Nachash were the words of the Mashiach. And in that instant, I switched over, and something changed. And I said, yes. And he said, a woman. And I said, yes. And it was like he was joining into me. And I don't know what had come over me. It wasn't Shechvat Zera, but it was something greater, holier than anything I had felt. I realized it was the female waters from within me. And I was shouting, yes, yes. And I was releasing the waters, mamish. And I moaned a sound I had never heard before. And he kept saying it, like davening almost, a Russia, a chassid, a woman, a man. And he finished, and his seed was inside me, and he was part of me, and we collapsed together, and we lay together. And I knew there would be no tshuva from this. In telling this to you, Rebbe, I have to say, maybe I've changed my mind. I came to you to do tshuva, to beg your forgiveness and God's, but I don't know even what that means anymore, if you can hear me, or even if you still exist. Perhaps the klippas that I encountered were really the klippas noga. They were uplifted, unified in this way. Maybe I had the zechus to taste the me'ein olam haba, that is the aspect of Mashiach, like the tzaddikim with their bittul hayesh, except greater, deeper, because it's found in materiality. And from such a place, Rebbe, how is one to do tshuva? How is one to return to Hashem, whom one can never leave? So he got it.
I mean, I have to say, if you only had left of our civilization, say our Jewish civilization, just those 2 paragraphs, you could do a very, very interesting reconstruction of where it all comes from. With mamish as the key, which, as a lot of you may know, that word is the leitmotif of Chabad messianism. And the acronym of the name of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and also a normative claim for the world. I mean, it's everything.
It's mamish also.
Those passages are everything.
It means like actually, like, and it's a really interesting doctrine. The last Lubavitcher Rebbe taught that the lowest is the highest, which is a Sabbatean heretical teaching. And it's the lowest that's the highest because it's the divine that's present in materiality, which is the lowest, but it's the highest because the divine has extended out to the maximal extent. And again, this is a straight up heretical idea from the 17th and 18th centuries. And mamish means like actually, really. It's also a verbal tick, if you know anyone in those worlds. Like people say mamish all the time, like, oh yeah, mamish, starving. I have to mamish, get something to eat after this. Mamish, I'm so thirsty, I need some water. Like you could say mamish a lot, but it also has this imminent theology to it. It's profound. And just because I don't believe that the Rebbe was the Mashiach or is the Mashiach or is still alive, and waiting to be reconstituted doesn't mean that I'm not completely fascinated by that. And, I used to live in Brooklyn, a neighborhood away from Crown Heights, and just recently, a couple of months ago, there was the tunnel that was being built, and it was at the strangest juxtaposition, right? Where like in this war were tunnels, right? And now there's like the Jewish tunnel going from like the shul to the other shul. And it was this bizarre mystical parody of like the hardest, most difficult thing that we're living with right now. And yet there it was, right? It was this like intense devotional, then I took a nice deep dive, like nerding out into like the different sects. And it was like this sect was on this place. It was literally like the joke about, they find a Jewish guy in a desert island and he's built 2 synagogues. And like, what'd you do that for? He's like, well, that's the one I go to and that's the one I won't be caught dead in. That's what it was. They wanted to get from the shul where they'd had their minyan into the main shul at 770. But the main people wouldn't let them do it. So they literally dug a tunnel, which itself is kind of an act of unification. Right? It's like we got the Sitra Achar over there with the Mishichistim. So anytime, I'm just endlessly fascinated by, I just have such a love for that capacity of the human soul/body to do this weird stuff.
One more question before we kind of gradually make our way to a broader conversation. One thing you do incredibly well throughout your fiction, and I really admire this because it's so, I write in a bunch of genres, but fiction is not one of them.
Yeah.
Because fiction is so hard. It's so much harder than everything else. Even poetry is not as hard as fiction. And one of the things that you do so well is you have to be very specific in fiction at the same time as you use that specificity to open up something that is more, in some sense, universal. And your characters are incredibly specific. They're often identified by not just the Jewish world that they're in, but the way that they're peripheral to that Jewish world because they arrived at it in a certain path or they're on one edge of it in some way. So you do, it's incredibly detailed, so much so that in one of your stories, I think it's the one that's an intertext with the ascent story that we talked about. There's actually, like we're near the climax of the story, and you pause for just a second to give us the cultural specificity of the boy who comes out of nowhere to save or not save the day. So you do an incredible job with the specificity. And since I know some of these worlds, I'm like always blown away by how exact it is and how spectacularly exact it is. And then you like blow it all up. You blow it all to smithereens. Like nothing is what it's supposed to be. So I guess I wanted to ask you about your own experiences in life in going in and out of these very different arcane Jewish worlds. They're arcane to the outside. They're not arcane when you're inside them. They seem completely normative. But I wanted to ask about your own experience in relationship to your own subjectivity in these very specific places where you've like nailed down every single detail and then you just blow it all up.
Well, that story, the ascent of Hannah Rivka Kornfeld, which was read, presented a little bit at the beginning, was based on a couple that I knew in Mea Shearim, an American Oleg couple, and it was an abusive relationship, and it was the connection between the personal violence in the home and the political anger. And the first draft of that story was actually written quite some time ago. The first version of all of these tales, it goes back almost 20 years, and then they were redone and redone and redone and redone. And there it was seeing this, and so that was before our current moment where I think rage is like the dominant emotional, theme of American political life right now. But it was seeing that homology or that coexistence of that personal and prophetic rage. For me, I gave up the idea that I would ever have like, this is what I am in a community. Like I was thinking, oh, I should have a guru or a teacher or a rabbi. And luckily I've been blessed to have, half a dozen, but it's never been one. And I mean, you're much, I think you have a more like a settled in the institutional establishment life that I have, which I definitely envy. And yet there's still also that like, there's always the little bit of outsider within that I appreciate in your work, and it's certainly true in mine. And that, for me, there's a story where there's another American, Ola, in Israel, who appreciates that everyone there is a little bit marginal, a little bit weird, because if nothing else, they've given up a certain kind of material existence in the United States to live in this other environment. And I can really kind of resonate. A lot of these are lives that I considered and didn't lead. The only character in the whole book that's really very close to me is in The Secrets of Nakedness. It's kind of a younger version of me. But it's funny because I definitely get asked a lot, well, is this autobiographical? Like there's another, you just got the sex scene in Central Park. There's a sex scene in a mikveh. People are like, was that autobiographical? I was like, I wish. No, I don't really wish. That was not. Although I will say that that story, the one with the mikveh, is written in first person, and an earlier version of it was published online a few years ago. And after it got published, I would get these emails from people saying, thank you for telling your story. Mine is the same.
Yeah.
And this character is really tortured. I mean, he's really having it's a hard life.
Yeah.
And my heart, I was so happy that I had rendered that in such a way as to be persuasive, but my heart was breaking that this was somebody's life.
Jay, thank you for this extraordinary book and for that wonderful, wonderful account of it. And let's open it up to the audience for some questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, both so much. Noah, in your book, when you're talking about, because you do this great taxonomy of different ways of being Jewish, and you say, I'm not going to give the denominational one. There's Orthodox, there's Conservative, there's Reform. That's kind of new, it's very American, and it doesn't really capture the whole breadth, and it's not the best way to talk about things. And so instead of Orthodox, you talk about people, is it traditionalism? And when you get to near the end of that section, one of the things you say is, you've moved away from traditionalism yourself in terms of your own practice. And you say, but there's a way in which not only I, but all Jews who have a commitment to Judaism, or as something that should exist in the world, we're all a twinge grateful that the traditionalists exist. I think you say both because it's basically because even people who move away from practice do so in reaction to the practice, and the practice as an old thing that makes a claim to going back to Sinai has to continue to exist for our Judaisms to make sense. I might have misprized that somewhat. So I guess I actually want to ask both of you. You've both been in Orthodox or orthopraxy at some time, where you've led Orthodox lives, and neither of you does now, as I gather. Your book gave me a twinge of the gratitude that you have that other people are continuing to do it, even as you disagree with some of their religious claims, often their political claims, et cetera. I'm curious from both of you, your feelings as ex-Orthodox or Orthodox practicing people. How much do you miss or still admire? How much are you glad to be away from, and maybe what's in the middle?
I love that question. I was orthopractic for 10 years, including our time at law school. People sometimes ask me, did you stay in the closet because you were Orthodox? And I say, no, I became Orthodox because I was in the closet. And it was it was a way of having a kind of really sweet interpersonal connection with people. Like, it was like love in a community that ultimately I couldn't live in. I tried. I would have stayed maybe. I don't know. I always feel like gay people have it easy. Like we get pushed out a little bit more. It's like, no, you can't be in here. And so like, I'm sort of not really being serious, but there is that sense of like, okay, I couldn't really make a life in that world, but it was that richness of that I'm grateful I had those years. And there is, I think, progressive Jewish communities, progressive religious communities really struggle to replicate that. And that's true in Christianity as well. Again, like the ascendant forms of Christianity in America are not the kind of more progressive forms, right? And it's hard without the juiciness and the intensity and even maybe the shared, if it's not belief in myth, then at least the embrace of the myth, that without that, it's hard, it's really hard to create that. And I think I was drawn to some of Jewish renewal and places like that because it's some of the spaces in a non-Orthodox and non-traditional context where that is, that energy is still present. And that was fun with these characters to re-inhabit that world where it's so rich and thick, sometimes too rich and too thick.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. And I would just extend that to say it's totalizing. So the thing about being Orthodox, even if you're just a serious modern Orthodox Jew, and certainly if you're a Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jew, is that everything you think about from the first moment you get up in the morning to the last moment you go to sleep at night is in one way or another processed through and inflected by this entire thought world that is practical and spiritual, and sometimes it's deeply religious, and sometimes it's deeply this worldly, but it's never not all Jewish all the time. There's no, when you're in it, it can be incredibly suffocating because there's nothing outside of that. And when you're not in it, you realize there's nothing like it. Right? There's nothing like being in that, there's nothing like the complexity, the creativity, the spiritual capacity, the challenge, the tension that comes from being fully enveloped in a thought world and a communal world that is connected in some way, depending on how you see it, to the ultimate truth. And your goal in life is to make your own life consonant with a community of people who similarly feel to the divine truth, to the God whom you love, whom you are commanded to love, and whom you do love, and who also loves you. I mean, that is something it's almost incomprehensible outside of that realm. And that way, even if you're totally non-mystical, fully Orthodox Jew, you're living a fully mystical life, even if you're fully committed to your rationalism within that. And for me, I can retreat into that sometimes, through study, through engagement, through certain kinds of meditation, through showing up in synagogue. And then when that happens, I think to myself, have I ever gotten out of that, even if I want to? Do I really ever have a route out? I can sort of temporarily suspend my disbelief, but on some level, that's probably my route on consciousness. I mean, I'll just say a last word about this. When I was a kid, I was in something called the International Bible Contest, where you memorized big chunks of the Hebrew Bible. This was technically a modern Orthodox thing rather than an ultra-Orthodox. And the ultra-Orthodox didn't have anything like that at the time. Then they started memorizing Mishnah, and now they memorize Talmud. So they've kind of like gotten with the program. But in my context, it was Bible. And I'm always amazed when I'm like talking to a Bible scholar or engaged in some context, and someone mentions some biblical verse or other, and I still have the capacity to be like, well, that word occurs in this place, in this place, in this place, and I'm really happy about it. And that happened to me recently. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Bible scholar, and he mentioned something, and I came up, and I was really proud of myself. And I called my brother, who's 2 years younger than I am, and I kind of bragged to him, because he's my brother. You can brag to your brother, as you're about to see what happens when you do that. And I said to him, like, I didn't lose it. Like, I remembered this. Maybe I don't have Alzheimer's yet. And he laughed at me, and he said, dude, when you have Alzheimer's, all that's going to be left is the Bible. He was 100% correct.
I was just thinking, one of the various titles that we workshopped for this session was about alternative Jewish futures. And without that, I'm curious, again, this is like part 3 of your book, but I have like various boutique Jewish futures that I feel like I really like and I'm really into, like the Kohenet program, my friend Jill Hammer's program, and Jewish priestesshood, and sort of a more radical embrace of the kinds of religious practice that were once called idolatry or avodah zarah, foreign worship. And like I have like a lot of, but I do wonder, you have that Bible thing in there because it was like really in there, right? And I grew up conservative, but like I did grow up with a lot of that stuff in your kishkas, in your guts, and I wonder how that looks like in the future. Because I don't think either of us are willing to buy into the hardcore immersion that both of us had
Well, it goes to Mark's point. Somebody is.
Right, so we'll
And
leave
in
it
fact,
to
a
them.
lot more people statistically are fully immersed than we were. You know, and then there will be all the other forms of Jewish life that are also of equal value, and in some ways, seen from a moral standpoint, look superior because they let you be trans or gay, because they let you be a woman and be a full equal participant, because they aren't hidebound, because they have the capacity to change. All the things that Orthodoxy, to a first approximation, lacks, and arguably in its more extreme forms must lack. So it'll all be out there. It'll all keep on going.
So I have two questions, and the first may pick up on Marx and maybe not. And if you look at the sociological landscape of the Jewish world, what you find, and this goes way beyond maybe the religious orientation that you're talking about, is that there's an eclectic, I'll call it an eclectic approach to being Jewish, or, you know, pick and choose Judaism that is, to a large degree, the dominant, I believe, way for most Jews in this country anyways. And my other question is, I'm not getting why you're using the word weird, and so I need a little bit more help with that. Okay.
Sure. I'll just say a quick word on the weird, and maybe you want to talk about the eclecticism. I mean, so a long time ago, like 16 or 17 years ago, I wrote an article and I was describing in part of it my Orthodox Jewish upbringing, and I was referring to tefillin. You know, so we're in a shul here, and people put on tefillin in this shul, not on Shabbos, but on the other days of the week. And as probably everyone knows, tefillin is one of those words that if you use the English word, you make it harder, not easier. Like the English translation is phylacteries. No one knows what phylacteries are. Like, what are phylacteries? Those are tefillin. It's utterly useless. But you know, tefillin are small leather. They're very old. There's some early version of tefillin that were found in the Bar Kokhba caves. So they've been around for at least 2,000 years. They're small leather boxes that hold biblical verses written on parchment, and then they're attached to leather straps, which you wrap around your body. And I commented in passing, this was around the time of the Da Vinci Code, that these, you know, vaguely resemble the leather straps that some very committed Catholics would wear under some circumstances. And one of the points in this article, many things in this article made many people very angry, but one of the points that people repeatedly came back to in their anger at me, Jews, was, how could you compare the tefillin to the Catholic leather straps?
Their straps
So
are weird.
that's my answer. Like, they're like, those people's straps are weird. Our straps are completely normal. Okay. I mean, that's what I mean by the weirdness, right? The things that seem to us, now you could have a Judaism that has really made an effort to take out the weird. And in some ways, Reform Judaism back already in the 19th century in Germany was committed to taking away as much of the weird as possible. The idea was, don't daven the way people in the Vilna Shul daven. You know, use English, even do it on Sunday, sit up straight, don't wave your body around in weird configurations. You know, your long, woolen, funny smelling after 30 years of use and before dry cleaning tallis should be replaced by something that's basically a silk scarf. You know, those were modes of de-weirdifying Jewishness. And now look at synagogues of almost every movement. People have re-embraced those things because they feel that those elements have positive components to them. And so those are things, you know, waving a palm frond on the holiday of Sukkot, waving the palm in the air. Say, oh, that's completely normal. Yeah, I mean, it's normal somewhere, you know, but it's not normal. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. And that is right up to and including, you know, the Passover Seder, you know, or not eating on Yom Kippur.
And what's weird about it is not just that it's strange looking that we're wearing these straps on our, you know, and sacred texts, but that they connect to the non-rational, deep, just non-rational beliefs, superstitions. It's magical, it's talismanic. You know, it's like the blood on the doorpost. It's deep and profound in a way that cannot really be reduced, no matter how Maimonidean one wants to be, that cannot be reduced to rationality. And the same with the, you know, I love Sukkot. It's my favorite Jewish holiday because it's the most pagan and it's the most, we're waving in the, you know, I come to my friends in like the neo-shamanic world and, you know, they're like, wow, shamanism, you know, so awesome. And I was like, yeah, Jews don't know about that. We just just take our 4 magical fruits and vegetables and wave them in the 6 directions to bring the rain, right? I mean, these are the strata of the Jewish tradition that I love. And that to me goes to the eclecticism too. I mean, I think there was a fear for a little while about some, like, obviously it can be a dilettante around spiritual eclecticism and just take the fun parts off the salad bar. But I think we've now seen for 20 odd years that it's also possible to do so with more serious discernment. And this is the world we live in, right? We live in a world of the internet, right, where everything is available and accessible in a way that it just wasn't before. And there are things that Jewish folkways do, I think, really, really well. And then, I'm equally nourished by the Buddhist Dharma, and I am nourished by those sort of earth-based communities that I'm part of. And so I think eclecticism, whether we like it or not, is here to stay. I mean, we'd have to build even taller kind of walls to keep folks in, and maybe the costs of doing that and the associations of that outweigh the benefits.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm interested in, I don't know, I don't mean to be like, irreligious or anything, but, hearing that, well, religion is generally a good, positive thing. I have mixed feelings about that. Sure. Some of that, I think, as a not particularly observant Jew, but observing a lot of things that have been done in the name of Christianity, for example. And having spent some time in the South, I went to college in Tennessee, so seeing what Alabama's doing doesn't surprise me that much. But I guess I'm wondering, for your take on, like, what does it mean if one is not particularly observant? Like, I don't have a regular Jewish practice, and at the same time, I feel I'm a writer, so I feel like it informs my writing, my sense of humor, the way I communicate with people. So, and then October 7th and everything in, Israel, even though I'm not really connected with Israel on a daily basis, but I found that for me, I felt it viscerally in my gut. So I definitely feel like I have a Jewish identity, but I don't have that ritual. And I grew up in a very, very Jewish world outside of Cleveland, in a community that was more Jewish than Brookline, but it was more Reform, more secular. So I'm trying to, I feel like I've spent a lot of my life kind of figuring out what does it mean to me to be Jewish when I don't have that traditional practice. And I still haven't figured it out, but I kind of feel like the struggle is maybe part of it. I don't know.
I mean, I will just, I have 2 chapters in my book that were literally written for you, one of which is about godless Jews, whose Jewishness is precisely played out in some other set of ways, in their cultural identities, in their affiliations, in their projects. And then the other is, I really have a few chapters about this, devoted to the core idea that Jewishness is struggle to make some sense of one's relationship to the universe, including a struggle about what it means to be Jewish if you don't have ritual and you don't believe in God. And then I add love to the struggle, because in the end, the thing about Jewishness, the Jewish version of religion, is that it's not inherently popular. My theory is that it's not a coincidence that there are, maybe 16 or 17 million Jews in the world, and, 1.75 billion Christians, and roughly the same number of Muslims, and more, almost as many Hindus and more Buddhists. All of those other faiths offer way more attractive pictures of a coherent, idealized life. The thing about being Jewish is that it theorizes that our relationship either to God or to the God we don't believe in is a lot like a human familial relationship, in which the people you love the most are also the people you struggle with the most, and in which there's pain and agony, and the family is simultaneously the place where you get your archetype of all that is good, and also where you get your archetype of all that is very bad, and I would say effed up in a more explicit way if I weren't in a shul, even if it's a decommissioned shul. So anyway, that's a short version, but that is, to me, a fully expressed Jewishness in its own distinctive way. And I would add, neither that kind of Jewishness nor any kind of Jewishness is an inherent good. I do not think religion is an inherent good. I mean, Jay mentioned Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who we called an important cabalist of our day, which I think is true, very influential and important cabalist. he and the people around him are committed to a view that is, in practice and in theory, messianist, millenarian, genocidal. And that's real. And it's as bad as it could be. I write about that in the book too. And that's religion. So it's not that it's not always good, very, very far from it.
That is the perfect setup for the what we'll close with. So the story that we started with, the ascent of Hannah of Kornfeld, both the part that you heard and the original conception of it was kind of a tragedy. And there was actually an earlier version which centered the husband and got rid of that. And then even an earlier version of this, it was hard for me to see the possibility for redemption. But I rewrote the story a bunch, and I want to read the end of it, which does have a kind of redemption. And spoiler alert, she comes back in a couple of the other stories, and her spirit returns and is not extinguished by the forces of anger, and has a resilience to it that I found redemptive. And like a lot of writers say, I didn't really come up with it. It just sort of appeared that was who she could become. So this is the very end of the ascent. And she'll say, as I find it in the book, she also had a very real encounter. In Israel, there is also a lot of weird religion and weird spirituality, particularly among non-Ashkenazic communities, Mizrahi communities, Sephardic communities, where veneration of holy places and holy people is more normalized or more central. And you can access that. You can see those magical circles and places in reality. And it's not that they're all necessarily completely redemptive either, but that there is an alternative that she had actually encountered. So this is the very end of the story. Obviously, she's been dead in the whole story, and this is the very end. I feel myself leaving. I still hear Eliezer raging, justifying himself and what had happened, rehearsing what he would tell the police, and then finally dialing for help. But this is not the last thing I perceive. I am at the mikveh, about to immerse. But there's a creature in the mikveh, a sort of manta ray, the sort of creeping, undulating thing that inhabits the floor of the ocean. I feel defiled, as if the creature's impurity has poisoned the mikveh and infected me as well. I see the skull of a mouse that, when I was a little girl, I'd once found in the basement. I see the electric Ner Tamid flicker over the ark of my childhood shul. But these, too, are not the last things I perceive. Because now I smell incense from the Atzei Shittim, the acacia trees rising in the crowded hall I once visited to receive blessings from a holy Rebbitzin. It's a sweet smell, unlike any other. As the Torah hints, there is a secret ingredient in this incense from the bark of the trees themselves that can cause prophecy and that the human brain itself produces at the moment of death. I feel it coursing through me. I know its provenance. And I see the manta ray in the mikveh transform into a great snake, the Nachash from Gan Eden, who opens Chava's eyes to the truth of the tree of knowledge. This snake is a woman. It is Chava's sister, Lilit. It is the doorway to death, and I enter her, and she enters me. And as this yichud takes place, I am no longer on the tile floor. I am a spark surrounded by thousands of others, reuniting with our source, a great, beautiful light that welcomes us. For a moment, I wonder if I'm worthy, if I must do tshuva to merit this dissolution, and I feel myself slip backward for a moment. But I am wrapped and held by the snake, which is now a woman, a womb, and a death, and a mother, saying only to me, yes. And I see countless other worlds and palaces and the halls of polished stone, and I know there is nothing I need to say or do to be worthy. And with that, I am enveloped in this organuz, this radiant and undying light, and I am dissolved into it, and I am no longer in that place, but here in this one, and the acacia is within me, and I am open and dissolved and here. Thank you.